Hello, are you ready? Yeah. So, coming to the afternoon part of the first day, and for the first hour, we start with a little video about freedom from the known. It's only 4 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. Then I will invite Don, Corey, and Patik over to sit here, and then we have a panel discussion which I will attempt to somehow organize. And I have some questions from the slides, and then after an hour we have a break, and then we open it up for questions from everybody. So the beginning part, the first hour, is the panel, and then the second hour is the whole group. Does that sound reasonable? Good. Then we start with the video.
Can the mind free itself from the known? The known is knowledge. The knowledge which I have accumulated about myself. The knowledge which I have gathered through experience during my lifetime. The knowledge which I have invited, which has become my habit, the very structure of my being. And that is the me. And that is the you. As long as the mind holds on to the known, it will always be frightened of the unknown. And can the mind be free of it and yet use it? It can use it only when it is free intelligently. When it is not free, it will misuse that knowledge, which is what is happening in the world. The known is the past, and in that there is no possibility of creativity. The release of creative energy, it comes into being only when thought remains in the field of the known and never moves over. So, the known as the yesterday, the unknown as the tomorrow, must move together harmoniously all the time. Then creativity takes place. If we are living always within the field of the known, which we are, then we are living mechanically. Thought has a legitimate place, and it can only function in the field of the known. Therefore, thought can never bring about freedom. Thought is never new. And when one realizes, not verbally, not sentimentally, not ideologically, but actually, as the fact, then the mind is free from the known, and therefore is free absolutely from fear. And therefore, the movement in harmony between the known and the unknown is creativity. And that, to me, is the significance, the meaning of life.
Yeah, yeah, they come. Patrick needs his, yeah. Yeah, I'd just like to start it off, and I have some questions, of course, from the introduction, which questions we want to address. And I thought a good question to start with, maybe with Don and then to Patik, it's like from what we heard this morning, is there any, do you see any, well, both, do you see any support or any contradiction from your field of work, perception or consciousness or mathematics, with the whole notion that Krishnamurti talks about freedom? So is there anything in support of that idea, or is there a proposal, is there anything in contradiction of that proposal? And both from Patik and from, but maybe Don, maybe you can start. It's a wide question, but I just thought it may be a nice thing to kick off.
I think that a lot of scientists would have trouble with that idea. Most think that our perceptions of space and time and physical objects are true. Not exhaustively true, but that I see the genuine shapes and colors and motions and hear genuine sounds and so forth. And that our perceptions are in that sense veridical, and there's no need to be free in that sense of them. The known, in some sense, I think they would say, is in fact the source we have of life, of being free. There is another aspect, though, and that is that we have a model of ourselves that we've built up. And so this now gets away from our perceptions of the external world, but now gets into our perceptions of ourselves. So with regard to the external world, I would say that they think that we've evolved to see reality as it is, and it's done a good job, so there's no reason to be free from that. Now when it comes to ourselves, it's a slightly different story. And there, the notion of freedom might play an interesting role in the following sense, that our models of ourselves, there it looks like they're just models. I'll give a concrete example that's quite telling. There are some people who have epilepsy that's intractable, in the sense that modern, or in the past, the drugs that were available could not control it. And for a few of those people in the 60s and 70s and earlier, in desperate cases they did a radical surgery. They would actually remove the cranium, and a fellow named Joe Bogan and some other surgeons would take a scalpel and they would go inside the brain and literally cut it in half. You have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. Each has about 43 billion neurons. And there's a band of fibers, of axons, that connects them. It has about 225 million axons. So 43 billion, and 225 million fibers connecting them. And what they did was they cut those fibers with a knife, separating pretty much the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. The reason for that was that if the epileptic focus was, say, in the right hemisphere, it could cause the right hemisphere to go down, but it couldn't cause the left hemisphere to go down. And it was a clinical success. It really did work in controlling epilepsy and making the seizures less violent. But they discovered that the two hemispheres have different personalities. You can actually, it turns out in careful experiments, you can ask questions to the right hemisphere and have it answer. you can ask questions to the left hemisphere and have it answer. And they systematically, in all the patients they discovered, gave different answers. What do you want to be? One guy, his left hemisphere wanted to be a draftsman, very safe, boring job. The right hemisphere wanted to be an automobile racer. And one guy, the left hemisphere believed in God, and the right hemisphere was an atheist. But one of the most interesting experiments was in the middle of an experiment. Michael Gazzaniga, who was an experimental psychologist who was studying them, he was doing an experiment with a split brain patient, and they were trying to study him, and he was being cooperative. And in the middle of the experiment, he gave a command to the right hemisphere, walk. So the left hemisphere didn't know what was going on. And so in the middle of the experiment, the person got up and started walking. And Gazzaniga pretended to be surprised and said, excuse me, we're in the middle of an experiment. Why did you just all of a sudden get up and rudely walk? And the left hemisphere, which is the only hemisphere that can talk. So whenever you're talking, it's your left hemisphere that talks. The right hemisphere can't talk. The person, without missing a blink, said, oh, I'm thirsty. I'm getting up to get a drink. Now what's interesting is the left hemisphere had no idea why the person had gotten up, because only the right hemisphere had been told the command to walk. But what's even more interesting is that the left hemisphere didn't know that it didn't know. It is so used to making up baloney that it doesn't even know when it's making up baloney. And the point is you don't need to have a split brain patient operation to have this problem. Our left hemispheres are baloney generators. That's a phrase that Steve Pinker likes to use, the baloney generator. And so now we have this situation where what we take to be insights into our very nature, into our desires, into our motivations, into why we're behaving the way we are. It turns out the left hemisphere is trying to make up stories not about the truth, but after the fact, to say something that makes you look like a credible, reasonable, well-rounded person. These are all stories. So most of what we believe about ourselves are stories concocted as social constructions to make ourselves look good, make others look good. So that's a deep illusion, and there would be then a sense in which it would be nice to be free from that, to be able to see what part of the story that we always tell ourselves is if there's any grain of truth in there at all, and what that might be. So scientists do it. We study neuroscience, we study cognitive science and so forth to try to understand what are the true kinds of motivations, the true kinds of structures that are guiding us, because the stories that we say are systematically false. The right hemisphere tends to be less involved in baloney generation. It tends to be more truth-facing. But in most of us, it appears that the left hemisphere is dominant, and the right hemisphere just has to go along for the ride. And you have this sort of model of the human. There's two different personalities that have been strapped into one skull, and they're both going on for the same ride, and they have very, very different personalities. And so when we talk about inner conflict, we see it right there. And that's probably just the first step of it. But you have literally an atheist and a believer, someone who wants to drive race cars and someone who wants to be a draftsman, stuck inside one cranium, forced to talk with 225 neurons between them. And that seems to be a setup for inner conflict. And I could imagine that there is a desire at some point for us to understand how you could have freedom as people, as a person, in that kind of situation. So I'd say the answer, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that there's a lot to the notion of freedom, and I think there's a deep contact that we could have between science and Krishnamurti's ideas on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't have a direct answer to that, because I wouldn't, it's been interesting because of all the questions we've been asking, these these past weeks and also yesterday and today. So I'm going to ask Corey a couple of questions that will then help me decide what to say. So in discussing this notion of freedom from the known, and when we discussed the notion that Krishnamurti suggested there's a quote-unquote right place for knowledge and a place that isn't right or isn't appropriate, and sometimes use this word psychological to describe that dimension where it's not right. So so the first question would be, in your understanding of it, I've been asking this question around to a bunch of people, in your understanding of it, is the process or state of freedom from this kind of knowledge one which then results in those kind of quote-unquote psychological memories or responses not coming up? Let's say when I see you tomorrow, I have an impression of you today, and part of that impression is just what you look like and your name, and part of that's the sort of psychological. I had a pleasant interaction with you, and so does that not come up in that state of freedom, or it does come up and then there's something subsequent to it coming up that happens that differentiates the state of freedom versus not being free? That'd be one question. And the other question that I've been asking around is, what is, for want of a better way of putting it, where does this this attention or perception or observation reside? And simply, is it something within the individual, but is not coming into play because it's been obfuscated by X, Y, and Z? But it's still a characteristic of an individual. It's a property. Versus it's not a property of an individual. Can be accessed by an individual, used like a tool can be used. But so if you want to tell us your thoughts about those two questions, then. But that has implications.
No, it's simple, really. Okay. So I'll start with the first question about if I just reword the question, does psychological freedom imply no arising of psychological memory, something like that? And I think where freedom seems to be important is not in the fact of psychological memories per se, but more in the movement in a psychological way interacting with my own memories. So it's not that that I no longer have an arising of any memory of you or our history, but it's my relationship to that memory itself where the freedom seems to be important. That somehow the implication is that there is a possibility that I'm free from having to manage to either support or deny or confirm, justify the memories that come up about you. And so then in a way they aren't the fabric of our direct relationship somehow. So the memories themselves may be there, but in some way they aren't active because they aren't the basis for my relationship with you.
The memory was based on a previous relationship and a record of that.
Yes, he said. So the memory was based on a previous experience, a previous interaction. So,
And assume it's factual.
yes, and assume it's factual. One thing that Krishnamurti does say often is that the very fact that a memory is recorded is a result of the experience not being fully processed at the time. So it also could be that in some sense, that the production of those kinds of psychological memories about you may not necessarily need to occur if you and I are in a direct relationship. So there's not any residual information that needs to be stored for later. That's sort of the implication. So in that sense, it may be that there's not the necessity for a psychological memory to remain as the basis for our relationship tomorrow. So there's different aspects, I guess, in answering that question. And then the second question was, what was it?
Second question was, yes, where does this quality of attention?
Oh, right. So, yes, yeah.
Is it an attribute of people that's
Yeah. I mean, so there, in direct quotes, you can find Krishnamurti stating that perception does not occur within the brain, to answer that specifically. How we discuss that is a question in itself, because we can speculate about what that means. So I'll leave that there.
Another aspect of this from the scientist's point of view is that most scientists will say that our memory is an evolved capacity. And so you can ask, why did we evolve memory? What were the adaptive problems that memory solved? And the answer ends up not being that memory evolved to give us a true description of the past. Our memories evolved to give us actionable information to keep us alive today and to make predictions tomorrow. And in the case of interacting with people, for example, the memories that we're going to form are the memories we would need to enhance our survival and in those interactions. So, and part of the framework that scientists use is an idea in which we're building models of the world all the time. Partly because that makes it easier for us to process information now. If I have a model, I have a framework in which I can take new information in now, and all I have to do is to say, here's what my model predicts is going to happen in this situation. As I get new information coming in, I just have to check, is it close to my predictions or not? If not, then I need to adjust my model. But the idea is very much in the simple case, like how we compress images to send them, right? If I try to send you an image and it's 10 megabytes and I don't want to deal with all that, a simple kind of compression is to say, let me find the average value of the whole image. Maybe out of 256 values, the average is 128. Then every pixel, I don't have to tell you the exact value using a full 8 bits or 10 bits for each pixel. I might only need 2 or 3 bits because that's how much that each pixel varies with respect to the average. And so by having a model, you can reduce the amount of information moment by moment that you need to use. And since evolution is trying to do things with the lowest number of calories possible, there are selection pressures for us to minimize the amount of information we're having to process now. Because, as you pointed out, we have only 25 watts of energy that we're using. So we're doing data compression all the time, and that means we're actually building models. And those models are absolutely essential for us to keep the energy consumption down and to make predictions about people's behavior. So if that person with the sphere tried to throw that spear at me yesterday and missed, there's a good bet that I shouldn't stick around if he's going like that with a spear. And that's a memory that I really need, and that's information that I really need to use, and those who don't use it don't pass on their genes. And so in that sense, the models are in our memories of people. Now I'm just giving you the evolutionary framework that most of my colleagues work in. Their idea would be we don't need freedom from that kind of known. If you walk away from that kind of known, you don't pass on your genes, and you're free in that sense. You're gone. You're completely gone. So those who are going to pass on their genes must have very effective models and use them. But now there's another way that you go at this, and you can say, well, look, you can have a model that's good enough to keep you alive, but what if you perseverate and you just keep thinking about the model and just living in that model? So in other words, you can actually spend too many calories playing with that model, more than you need, and you can get obsessive and so forth. So there could be a sense in which you might say we need freedom from the known in that sense, where someone becomes psychologically obsessed and can't let go of the model when they don't need to be using the model. Then you would, a scientist might say, there's a chance where you might have freedom from the known there. And again, I'm not trying to advocate for the scientist's point of view. I'm just trying to state the scientist's point of view. One could step back and ask, is there a deeper point of view that the scientists aren't thinking about in which we would like to be free from models altogether? And I think most scientists would probably give you a blank stare, because that would, in some sense, saying, is there a way to talk about us that completely walks away from the entire evolutionary framework in which we're thinking about human nature? And that could be a very important and interesting question, but I think most scientists are just going to look at you cross-eyed, and so.
Let's see how Pratik is looking, because he was going to answer this. Cross-eyed, I think.
No, of course, I don't have an answer to that, but here's how I think about it. Maybe a few steps. So I don't think we need to discuss the role of memory, because that's apparent to most of us. But we're talking here about these so-called psychological memories. I think we've discussed, and there seems to be at least a reasonable point of view, that Krishnamurti is not even talking about not having or not evoking psychological memories, but it's something that happens after that gets evoked. And that's one place where there's this, at least this question of freedom from whatever happens after. So the obvious question that needs to be asked is what sort of an analysis of the cost benefit of doing that versus not doing that. Because if we start from the observation, and I don't think that would be a controversial observation, that most of us do that. So then the very fact that we do that either means all of us have gone off on some weird track, which is unlikely. One or two of us might have, but you know, every human, or almost every human, that's very unlikely. Humans don't have features that have no adaptive purpose or benefit. I mean, no organism, not just humans, because they wouldn't subsist. They come and go. So what is the adaptive benefit? And then, you know, I'm thinking along the same lines as Don was suggesting, that in sort of, I had an encounter with you a week ago. On Sunday, I'm at the farmer's market. I see you at a distance, and I not only recognize who you are and so on, But also the memory comes up about the valence of that previous encounter. It might be positive, it might be negative, and that then might motivate me to either come and talk to you or to avoid you and go in the opposite direction. So the argument is, well, you're not meeting him afresh because you're bringing this to your behavior. And so what is the cost benefit of doing that versus trying to meet you afresh? And so if there was a sort of blank slate miraculously in terms of that, not carrying or not allowing that aspect of the psychological memory to motivate my behavior, then there are costs to that, because I also see at the farmers market Claudia and Raman and 2 or 3 others, and I'd much rather go talk to Raman than you any day. You wouldn't blame me for that. So what's the point of? But this has to be understood now even deeper. This isn't just a question of whom to talk with and spend 5 or 10 minutes with. It goes so deep, these sort of psychological things. So for instance, we can keep going why, and there are, I think, superb answers. But one fact is that humans and most primates have a really long period after birth before they're self-sufficient. By self-sufficient, I mean capable of harvesting their own food and taking care of themselves. They're dependent. If they're not cared for, if they're not provided stuff, they won't be able to survive very long. So in that, it's not just a recognition of who gives me food, but who offers a sense of a certain kind of psychological security, that if there weren't, it becomes very apparent what the consequences of that are, and you see that in the very unfortunate cases of children who've been abused in different ways. Many primates, including humans, have evolved to share responsibilities in taking care of offspring. And if there weren't 2 people to share the responsibilities, someone to gather food, someone to take care of, why would those 2 people after reproduction stick around with one another unless there wasn't this quote-unquote feeling of love or affection or attachment, specifically, not to every human being, but specifically between a male and a particular female that lasts and that is stronger than that male with other females or that female with other males. There's a whole bunch of extraordinarily important purposes that these sort of psychological phenomena fulfill. And then you can go, why those and why those? And it's not difficult to go back in time. It's not difficult to understand why. There's another very powerful thing about illusions about groups before we get to individuals. So now the current understanding about why it is that we find security in sort of group identity, nationalism or a particular religion or whatever, even though there is no factual basis for that, has to do with the tremendous amount of cooperation that it engenders between people who don't know one another, but simply can show you a badge of membership of that group, if you will. So simply by, I don't know these 4 or 5 people, but just the fact that they're the same group as me makes it more likely to cooperate. And probably the biggest difference between humans and other non-human primates is characterized by the amount of cooperation that humans have extended among one another to do things. I mean, if you think about it, we use lots of tools, and there are very few of us who have the knowledge to put any of those together. And a lot of that is a result of tremendous amount of cooperation that has happened. And cooperation is facilitated tremendously, at least between people who don't know one another, by group membership. And so it does not matter that that group has no existence per se, like a religion or a nation or whatever, as long as the brain believes that that's real. And then there are effects of that belief or that illusion. Those effects are real. And on balance, of course, nationalism and religion has been a cause for conflict between groups of people and lots of killing. But on balance, the cooperation that it has engendered by thousands and thousands and thousandfold has benefited humans more than the cost that has been paid by the conflicts and the wars and so on. I mean, it might sound very, very strange, particularly in a Krishnamurti setting, but there's lots of data on this. So the challenge is, as Don, I think, said, what is the appropriate place of those, not the absence of those? And we've already said it's not the absence of that kind of psychological memory, but and it's a mystery as to what that process is where it can come up, but then it somehow doesn't take hold of you. Don't quite know what that means.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. When do these prior biases, are they helpful? When are they hurtful? And when should we approach a person fresh? And when should we look at our past model of the person? It's a non-trivial question. There's a couple interesting things, again, from the science side on this. One about when we might want to let go of our models, which is very interesting. A fellow named Jim Fallon, who's a neuroanatomist at UC Irvine. He's one of the world's foremost neuroanatomists. And a few years ago, he took me into his lab and showed me some scans he'd got of people's brains in a very emotional task. He showed men and women some very emotional stimuli. And what he was very excited to show me was that in all of the men, the right amygdala had been excited. And in all of the women, it was the left. A complete sexual dimorphism in the behavior. But that wasn't the most interesting thing. The subnuclei that were active in the amygdala of the men were almost entirely different from the subnuclei that were active in the women. And they projected to different parts of the body. The implication being that men and women are wired up very, very differently in their response to emotional stimuli. And that suggests the following possible problem. If someone is acting in a certain way and you're trying to figure out why did they behave that way? One of the best things you can do usually is to say, well, what would I have to be thinking and feeling to behave that way? And these data suggest that if a man uses that kind of technique to try to understand a woman, he'll probably get the wrong answer. Right? That the model that the man is going to build of the reasons and feelings of the woman will be the wrong model. And we cannot think out of that box because that's the world that we know. It's, how else could you behave that way? I mean, how else could you, what else would you be thinking and feeling if you behaved that way? I couldn't imagine that you would think that's, so in that case, maybe a good psychotherapist would tell the men, maybe you need to maybe let go of your model and try to think outside of, freedom from that known may be very, very helpful. And it goes the other way as well. Women will have their models of men that will have to let go. But this could be a source of all sorts of problem in relationships where the models we're building as honestly as we know how could just simply be dysfunctional because we've made deeply held assumptions. And you might say, well, that surely violates evolution, because evolution would try to make us have models that would bring us together and so forth. And it turns out from strictly evolutionary grounds, that's not the case. As long as you mate and have kids, evolution is fine. Happiness in your marriage is not one of the strictures of evolution. It's just not. There are no selection pressures to be happy in your marriage. So we can't assume that evolution would have shaped us to have true models of the inner motivations of our spouses. So that's, but on the other hand, another interesting aspect from the scientific point of view is, if you don't use the best models that you've built so far in interpreting your data, it turns out you're incoherent. So it's actually a logical fallacy to ignore your prior experiences and the prior beliefs that you've come to based on those experiences. It turns out if you this is called Bayesian updating. If you don't update your beliefs according to Bayes' rule, where you use your prior, the current experience to get the posterior. If you don't do that, you're incoherent, and someone can make what's called a Dutch book against you. I can set up a bet where no matter what the outcome is, you lose. So you're incoherent in that sense that you can be taken advantage of. So there's this interesting tension. Letting go of the known, in that technical sense, is incoherent. On the other hand, letting go of the known when you have good reason to believe, like when Jim Fallon shows me these neural images and says, look, the model that you're going to build is probably going to be the wrong model of your wife or your husband. It's probably going to be the wrong. So in that case, it would be coherent to let go of it. So, but I think that maybe Krishnamurti was talking about an even deeper thing that I'm talking about here, that letting go of models altogether. And that, I think, is a different level of conversation. But
I don't know if that's the case, because I think and I'm not sure I can say what I want to try and say, but I think it's something more to do with, because even for us to discuss and decide categorically that there are certain models or experiences that we should not trust and others that we should, I think misses the point. But that more, the question is, for a human being, is there a such thing as a means of understanding that whole process without having to categorically be predetermined in your understanding? I don't know if that makes sense. So what it's not to take for granted that we've sort of been evolutionarily, we've developed and we have these models and they do function, and in many ways they do serve a purpose, but there are areas where they may overstep their bounds and create conflict in our lives, or give us misinformation, or so what is it that is there something that can see that as it for what it is, that doesn't have to have it laid out beforehand? So it's not that we decide that categorically this section here is in question, be it what we call psychological or my reactions to psychological. It's something that, like, even in our attempt to unpack this, we're sort of expressing our common way of living, which is we do seek to categorize and then function in the world with some sort of formula to be functioning correctly. But the question is whether or not there's something, call it intelligence or perception or something, that can see danger if it's there, but doesn't have to be primed to know that it's dangerous before it sees it. something like that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but because I think there's a level that it's important to sort of help to distinguish what parts of knowledge seem to be the ones that cause the danger. But I think the question really is there something in the human being that doesn't require that as knowledge to apprehend it, but that can live a life where when there is danger, particularly in the psychological realm, it can see it as though it sees physical danger and respond directly, as opposed to having to have that built in as a model. Does that make any sense? The difficulty I have with saying that is that it almost sounds like then we have to propose that there's something like intelligence or perception that's sort of beyond us that comes in and acts, and I don't know. Yeah.
So, yeah. So actually I was going to ask you to expand on that a bit more, but before that, just a brief rejoinder to Don. So you said that evolution doesn't care about happiness in marriage, but of course it does and must, because the partners are more likely to stay together when they're happy, and that has obvious implications. So of course there would be a selection pressure, but anyway, that's a minor point. But then moving to that question of what's the source of attention or perception, and where does it reside, if one can even put it in that language. So I've been asking a whole bunch of people over the last few days, and I've had divergent responses. For example, or someone says it must be somehow an attribute or a property of an individual, because Krishnamurti doesn't go outside the individual till this point of the happening of freedom, or if you can put it. And then some others said, and it sounded like you're also saying that, well, he says it's outside, or at least outside the brain. So in your readings and understanding, you want to say a little more about?
Yeah, so another way to look at it, which may show I guess the difficulty in asking the question that way, is that the other way it's stated is that if there is such a thing as total attention, what that is equivalent to the absence of an entity that attends. So the very absence of an entity attending is attention. So it's not as much a question of where that attention resides as much as it's almost it's the natural, there's something natural about it in the absence of an entity attending. So in that sense, if I can sort of draw it out, the whole perception not being of the brain seems to be somehow related to that, in the sense that the brain is knowledge which is recorded in the cells from the past. That recorded knowledge with its models and is typically what I, as a unique observer, am using to live and exist and understand my world. But the implication somehow is that attention has nothing to do with the recording in the brain cells in that regard. Somehow if knowledge as the brain is no longer acting as an attendee, attention is there.
I just want to sharpen, and then you can. So, and I mean, first, I think I understood you correctly when you said, well, I mean, it's clearly that when we have new knowledge, we update our models, right? So that first gives already evidence that the model is not fixed; it's updatable. So that's that one. So that gives us some clue that if there's some need, if there's some seeing or some understanding or some additional information that's been understood as being better, that the model can be updated. So I think that's an important bit of information, because that means that it's not fixed, at least. So there's movement possible. Then the second thing, is it tenable, I think, that we can make this distinction between the physical realm, the man throwing the spear, which I think Krishnamurti would categorize that, in my understanding, as the physical fear, right? The physical fear, and he would say, well, that's very useful. Walk away from the man with the spear. Don't be free of that. I think, I mean, I'm just putting my understanding out, right? I think so. That there's a domain, a psychological domain, where these models also happening, this modeling is also happening, where it seems to cause suffering. Let's put it that way. It seems to cause suffering. So it's one domain where it seems to cause suffering. So somehow he says, well, the physical realm, the man with the spear, of course it's scary, but somehow it doesn't cause suffering. It's just a fear response, walking away. The precipice, fear response, walking away. It's not that there's an anticipation of it, and therefore a lingering on it, a state of tension of it. I mean, the fear and the action seems to be immediate. There's no space in that. And the suffering seems to be in the space between the what is and what should be, something like that. I don't. So I just want to, I would like to draw out, because that was one of our original questions, is that distinction, to make that distinction between the psychological and the physical, between the psychological and the, what you just called maybe the baloney generator or the narrative self, is that distinction feasible? Is it feasible? Is there supportive evidence, or is there any way that we can say, well, you know, there is, it could be or it could not be? Is there evidence in any direction about that? Yeah.
So neurobiologically, one place I think most scientists would go in response is there's something called the default mode network in the brain. And when you are daydreaming or thinking about yourself, ruminating about yourself and social relationships, the default mode network is quite active. And when you are doing a visual attention task or attending to some other kind of task, that tends to shut down this default mode network. And so it appears that the default mode network is involved with ruminating about yourself, about your social relationships, but also daydreaming more generally. And so that is, in one sense, what we would quantify what we mean by purely psychological, as perhaps opposed to, say, what you might call a physical psychological state. And there again, I think the attitude would be that, look, if your default mode network is behaving properly, then you're learning how to behave properly in social situations. That's good. It's only when it becomes obsessive, for example, and you're spending too much time on it, or the opposite, you're not doing enough and you become psychopathic, so in some sense it's rather, you know, it's not good or bad, is it appropriately adjusted to the social situation that you're in. But I think that there's a deeper sense in which most scientists would think about this whole question about, do we bring models and memory to our experiences of the now with people, and that is, just take the case of vision. At the eye, there are no colors. There are no lines. There are no objects. The eye only has 130 million little photoreceptors, and each photoreceptor only reports, I caught 10 photons, I caught 3 photons, I caught 5. That is, from the scientific point of view, the physicalist point of view, the starting point of vision. It is 130 million numbers, end of story. Nothing else. Now, if you see something besides 130 million numbers in your perception, that is entirely due to memory and your processing. And in other words, there is absolutely no way to just attend to the visual world without immediately bringing in enormous amounts of memory. The same thing, I use vision, the same thing is true of every one of our senses. It's quantum catches and photons in the eye, it's hair cells wiggling in the ear, but if you're not directly aware of hair cell wiggling, if you're aware of cars moving and things like that, all of that is memory. And so it's absolutely not possible to be just present, even forget social stuff, just being present with what is without memory, because everything that you're present with is entirely, from the get-go, the result of memory. So the only way that we could take this idea of Krishnamurti all the way and say no memory whatsoever would be to have absolutely nothing in our perceptions, literally, utterly free of any perception, of any kind that we know about. So memory goes all the way down to the very earliest wiring in your retina. So that's a very, very deep level that we'd have to go.
But I try to sharpen that. So, I mean, is there a subdomain? Like that domain seems to be perfectly fine, right? So the perception, the auditory perception, visual perception, the physical fear seems to be all. Is it tenable to say, well, there's a psychological, a subset, psychological memory, psychological modeling, where you can say, well, a human could function without that. It's even that there is such a thing as a subdomain that you can isolate. That the narrative self, the baloney generator, as you called it, is somehow tenable. Yeah.
Well, this might be close to what you're getting at. There is a field called evolutionary psychology, and in that field, and it's fairly new. It's only the last 30 or 40 years. It turns out we can have principled understanding of the logic of human emotions, the logic of social interactions, even the logic of why someone might both love and hate another person at the same time. It even gives a logic for altruism. We typically think of Darwin and evolution as an explanation for nature red in tooth and claw, but of course it couldn't deal with why people are kind to each other and altruistic. And it turns out that an extension of Darwin called inclusive, so Darwin didn't actually have this idea he had an idea of fitness, but in the 1960s a guy named Hamilton realized that there was a natural extension of Darwin's idea to something called inclusive fitness. And when you go to that model, it turns out it is a wonderful model that quantitatively predicts your altruistic behaviors to other people, how much and when you will be altruistic. And in fact, it's the only mathematically precise model that we've ever had to predict altruistic behavior. So we can think about, so there is a domain in which we have actually powerful, in fact, mathematically precise and quantitatively powerful theories that can predict when you will behave nicely to people, even at risk to your own life. So altruism is defined in evolution as doing a behavior that will enhance the fitness of another organism at a genuine cost to your own fitness, including possible death. So, and it turns out evolutionary mechanisms can actually bring about that behavior. So there is an area of the psychological that's genuinely psychological, where it has its own real principles, and they're actual literally mathematically precise principles that we can write down. And we can use them to predict human behavior, and even it's to the point now where we can begin to look at social institutions and political institutions and begin to understand how the institutions will tap into, bring out the better, as Steven Pinker puts it in one of his books, the better angels of our nature, like altruism, and not trigger some of what we might call the darker aspects of human nature, which are also in there. My competitiveness, my willingness to hunt someone down and get revenge at any cost. We can actually set up social institutions that bring up the better angels, and so there is this whole domain that's a genuine new science. It's only been in the last 30 or 40 years. My department in 1991 had one of the founders of this field, Lita Cosmides, come to give a job talk in my department. So in 1991, that's not that long ago. She was launching the field, and I said, we need to hire this woman. You know, this is in my department. Senior members said, no, this is nonsense. Well, it's burgeoned into I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect. It's a growing science, but we now have genuine, mathematically precise insights into human nature that actually show the logic of our emotions, the logic of our desires, the logic that governs what we're doing. It's very, very powerful. So it would be in that context, in that very rich context of the mathematical theory, that I would love to then ask, okay, how can we step back? What parts of that psychology do we want to step back from? Or what parts do we want to actually enhance? But I'd love to hear from a Krishnamurti perspective.
Yeah, of course, yeah. 5 more minutes? Okay, yeah, good. Yeah. Well, I'm through with that question, but maybe anybody wants to respond.
Well, I don't know if I even have anything to say, but I feel like I do. But it's something about. So I feel like somehow we're a bit caught in attempting to narrow down what it is we're even. In terms of being specific about what it is about psychological that is the danger, or what is the issue.
Yeah.
And I feel like something it has to do with being clear about what we mean by suffering.
Yeah.
And not so much, or maybe to distinguish between, if we keep it at psychological versus physical, distinguishing between pain and suffering, but also looking at how the way we function as a psychological entity may cause and prolong a kind of suffering, or maybe the root of a kind of suffering. So it's in that regard that knowledge may be functioning in a way that is either obsessive, or there's something that to put it in that way, there may be an area in which we're obsessed with ourselves, but we don't know that we're obsessed with ourselves. And that causes suffering. But our attempts to solve the suffering don't meet the issue, because the issue is ourselves somehow. In that regard, it's a psychological problem and not one that's a physical one. And one that also doesn't require, I think it's true that there's no necessity to assume that a state of attention is meeting some clear, unobstructed reality. That there's real, that we have to admit and be honest about what the whole process of the brain, but that more that it has something to do with suffering, that really is to zoom in on that as the element of the psychological knowledge that is where the danger comes from, may be helpful in unpacking. Yeah,
I was just thinking, because like for Patik and also for Don somehow, if we have this word suffering, we haven't defined that word. Exactly, we have a Krishnamurti definition of suffering, but well, the suffering is that you are in a constant state from what is to what you think it should be. So that is the constant pressure. There's a constant pressure internally, which is the suffering. And now, is there a scientific word for that? I mean, it's in Buddhism, etc. I
Yeah,
believe,
yeah,
but
yeah,
is
yeah.
there a scientific? Does it? And
Yeah.
then I assume that both of you, I'm just putting it a little bit funny, but would have a reason that it has a very important purpose, evolution, because otherwise it
Yeah.
wouldn't be there, right?
Yeah.
So, or maybe not. Maybe it's a consequence of something, like something evolved for very good reasons, but it had a side effect. And because it's so good in one area, it's not good in another area. That's also a possibility. So, yeah.
One answer is going to be that has to do with a dopaminergic system that's part of a model building and model maintaining system that we have. That we're building models of what we expect the world to be. And if the world, in my new experience, is better than my model suggested it should be, I get an increase in dopamine levels, which I feel as pleasure. But if the world is worse than my model suggested it should be, my dopamine levels drop, and I feel that as pain, or it's a problem, it hurts. And the same, that's true in everyday life in terms of just, are these blueberries as good as I expected? If they're better, whoa. And if they're worse, like, well, these are mealy blueberries, and there's a little bit of, but it also is true in social relationships, is this person, I have a model of this person. Are they surprising me? Oh, I didn't know that they could play the piano. I didn't know that, so all of a sudden I have to increase my model, but I get a dopamine surge. But if it's worse, then that's the punishment, the pain side. So in some sense, that kind of pain is intrinsic to an organism that is building any models and is then updating those models. It's in some sense we call it reinforcement learning, and the dopamine signal is the learning signal. If it's positive, it's saying you need to. Your model needs to be up, and if it hurts, it means you need to bring it back down. So
I'm not sure if this is related or not, but I'll throw it out anyway. So many of us are used to thinking in terms of hunger and satiety as being quote unquote physical reflexes, impulses, whatever. Feel hungry, and then that motivates certain action to go find food, and when there's a sensation of satiety, that motivates the action to stop eating. And we sometimes discuss this business of I like or I don't like, or it gives me pleasure versus it satisfies hunger. And what many of us don't know is that been very good studies across a whole bunch of species that have found that if there isn't, along with the emergence of hunger, if concurrently there isn't a feeling of some sort of, I don't know what word to use, fear, apprehension, worry, concern, a sort of psychological thing about not finding food, then the individual or the animal shows absolutely no action in terms of going and finding food. That might sound very, very odd, that even when there is hunger, why would the animal, including the human, not go find food unless concomitantly there is a feeling of anxiety or deprivation or something. Similarly, with satiety, when there are satiety signals but you block the signals of dopamine and pleasure, the animal won't stop eating when there's a feeling of fullness, unless there is that psychological. So it's not so clear as many of us think that there's this clean separation between, even in the case of feeding, and I can give you instances, many other instances. like this. There's one other point I was going to make, but I've forgotten, so never mind.
Bring it up after the tea. I think we have tea break, yeah? Okay. 20 minutes. Yeah.